Good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Friedman. I'm the founder and CEO of Planet Word. And like many of you here, I would guess, a former or current reading teacher. So I'm especially pleased that you came out early on this Saturday, and especially if it's your usual day off, to attend a lecture on the reading brain. But also, because I am a former reading teacher, I'm not at all surprised to see any of you here because you're probably as eager as I was to always learn everything possible about how kids learn to read and to improve your practice to benefit all your students. We're especially grateful to Emily Hanford, Planet Word's very first journalist in residence, for inviting Dr. Dehaene to speak to us today. It's the first of many explorations that we'll have in our continuing Eyes on Reading series. As a producer and host of the award-winning podcast, Sold a Story, Emily has helped to shift the discussion and practice about how we teach reading in America. Through her research and reporting, Emily has made us all aware of the importance of evidence-based instruction and has introduced the phrase, the science of reading, to a wider general audience, one filled with parents seeking to understand why their children aren't learning to read proficiently, and also reaching teachers who are worried about why their instructional methods aren't always effective. So when Emily approached us about becoming a journalist in residence at Planet Word, we jumped at the opportunity. Planet Word was created as a museum about words and language with a mission of finding ways to engage and inspire visitors to love words, language, and reading, and with the vision that the foundation of a strong democracy depended upon a literate populace. But we knew that even though we weren't about to teach reading ourselves, we needed to be advocates for best practices in reading instruction and become a hub for literacy. How could we achieve our mission unless children were being taught to read successfully in our schools? So joining up with Emily, who would use her skills as a reporter and her curiosity, would help us achieve our goals. With her connections through the literacy space, Emily could help attract leading researchers and thinkers to Planet Word's stage. That was an opportunity too good for us to pass up. And atop Emily's list of people to invite to speak at Planet Word was Dr. Stanislas Dehaene. We are thrilled that he is able to join us on one of his rare visits to the United States. And I want to also thank my colleagues Caitlin Martin and Britt Oates for helping set this up along with Emily. And now here's Emily to tell you more about our special guest.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for coming. I know we have people from all over the country. I think we have Wisconsin, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, anywhere else? And all over Washington, the Washington, D.C. area. So thank you so much for coming. And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to be a journalist in residence at Planet Word. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Anne. I think this is such a cool museum. The first time I came here with my mother and my son a few years ago, I thought, I need to find out more about this place. And I just think it's a wonderful, we're just hearing a lot of noise outside because I think there's a school group here today. So language and children and reading, all my favorite things. So let me introduce our speaker today. Stanislas Dehaene has no idea how much he has taught me. When I reached out to him about coming here to Planet Word, I sent him a photo of my copy of his book, Reading in the Brain, which I'm sure many of you have read. And this is, a lot of my books look like this, but I think this is probably the ultimate example of the most sticky noted book on my shelf. I first learned about Dr. Dehaene and his work back in 2018. I was just beginning to learn about this big body of research that people are referring to these days in the United States as the science of reading. Dr. Dehaene comes to us from France. He is a psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist who directs the NeuroSpin Center, which is France's advanced brain imaging research center. His research investigates the neural bases of human cognitive functions, such as reading and also calculation and language. And he has a particular interest in the impact of education on the brain. There's a quote at the beginning of his 2020 book, How We Learn, which I highly recommend if you haven't read that one yet. This quote is from the former president of MIT, and he said, "If we don't know how we learn, how on earth do we know how to teach?" That's what Dr. Dehaene is here to talk with us about today, what we all need to know about learning, about the reading brain, and what we need to know about this to do a better job teaching all of our kids to learn how to read. So please welcome Dr. Stanislas Dehaene. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful hospitality and welcome. I am extremely happy to be here and to tell you a little bit about my work. I'm a brain scientist, but more and more I am interested in the impact of education, as you mentioned, and also the impact of our science on education, whether we can help to correct some of the difficulties that the education system has. So this is NeuroSpin, the place that I direct in the south of Paris, about 15 kilometers from Paris. Each of these arches that you see here has a magnet, an fMRI system, or another technique to image the brain. We have all of these techniques. The entire building is dedicated to trying to understand the brain. And in particular, we have currently the world's largest fMRI magnet. It's quite amazing. It's 11.7 Tesla magnet that you see here, this giant machine here, which is just starting to work. So we're trying to put all of these techniques to the service of understanding the human brain in particular, because we think the human brain is very special. It's the only one on the planet which has language, which is able to do science, mathematics, and of course reading. And to this aim, my wife and I, this is my wife Ghislaine, we're trying to put all of these machines to the service of understanding the child's brain, in particular the baby's brain. She's really working with very young babies. And I'm working on adults. We're joining when it comes to school children, sort of. So you can see that basically it's becoming feasible to deploy all of these techniques, whether this is MRI or EEG, or just behavior, or you can see MEG here, magnetoencephalography. This is electroencephalography. We can deploy all of these techniques safely, and with the collaboration of these children, who are like little cosmonauts in the magnet, we can really try to explore how the brain works. So that's what I'm going to tell you about. First discovery. 20-something years ago, my wife and I were the first to put infants, few months old infants, in the magnet and to scan their brains and to see how their brains work when they listen to language. And we knew that they have a lot of language abilities already at that age. But it was very striking to see this gorgeous image showing that when they listen to spoken language, they have a network of areas. It's not the whole brain lighting up, as you can see, but they have a network of areas that is already wired to channel and to process spoken language. And it's actually very similar to the adult language network, which you can see on the left. Essentially, you can see the temporal lobe, Broca's area in the inferior frontal region here, lighting up. Of course, I'm not claiming that the child is already understanding the words or the syntax of the language, but the signal from speech is already channeled to these areas that are going to acquire spoken language. And this is my first message. When it comes to spoken language, we have a clear network, which is already there very early on. In fact, in the first year of life, way before the child starts to speak, this network is already learning enormously about the structure of spoken language. And we know now that this spoken language is completely universal. You can see here the left hemisphere of, I think, something like 45 different people belonging to different language groups, this is the recent work from F. Fedorenko at MIT, you can see that regardless of the language that you speak, this network is going to light up when you process spoken language. It's also universal in the sense that if you are bilingual, you'll get very, very similar, if not exactly identical activation to each of your two languages. It might be a little bit different if you learn one of these languages later. Then you will have recruitment of additional areas. But if you learn the languages early enough, there will be a lot of overlap, if not perfect overlap, between two languages. So we have this, we think it's an evolved property of the human brain to have this spoken language network. And what happens when we learn to read? Well, we're going to reuse the very same network in order to understand written language. So written and spoken language converge to very, very similar brain areas. Here you see an image from the work of Jack Gallant at Berkeley. It's a beautiful image because it's a single person now. It's not a group, just one person. And the colors indicate different domains of meaning of the words the person is listening to. So the colors indicate, for instance, in pink and in red, the social related words. These areas here are related to mathematics, numbers, and space. But you can see the point of this slide is that you see very, very similar, if not identical, activations to spoken and written language. This is the miracle of reading acquisition. When we learn to read, we essentially learn to access this existing spoken language system through a new modality, vision, which was not anticipated by evolution. This is an invention now. So we have this evolved spoken language system, but we learn to access it with a new invention, the invention of the alphabet and of writing systems. So just a very simple slide here. Of course, I will try to simplify the findings as much as I can to convey them to you. But here is your left hemisphere. Before you learn to read, you have this spoken language network, which has knowledge of the phonology, the lexicon, the syntax, the meaning of spoken words and sentences. And when you learn to read, you're going to access it through the occipital pole, which has vision, where all of the visual inputs enter into the brain. You're going to develop a specific brain region that serves as the interface that recognizes the letters and sends the message about letters to the language areas, and in particular to a region that we call the planum temporale, where we have a representation of the phonemes of speech. And we believe that this connection between letters and sounds is the key to unlocking reading. After that, you will be able to go faster and maybe more directly to the lexicon, but initially, this is the key link here. So this area, which is the interface, I've called the visual word form area with my colleague Laurent Cohen, but you might call it the brain's letterbox, because this is the one place in your brain that has enormous knowledge of the statistics of letters, and this is an area that has developed because you've learned to read. Okay. So we see here the logic of what I'm going to tell you. Learning to read is not a complete change of brain networks. It's a recycling, that's the term I've been using. It's a reuse of existing areas, turning them, reorienting them into a new direction. We're going to reuse the language system for sure, but we're going to reuse it through vision, and therefore we're going to have to recycle an area that already exists in the child's brain, but that's going to be reoriented to the recognition of written letters, written words. Okay. So, first, I would like to show you some experiments about what changes in the brain when we learn to read. You're not able to learn to read this Rosetta Stone. Maybe there is an Egyptologist in the room that can read it. But, okay, so what happens when you learn to read? We did, I think, what was a key experiment, difficult one. We wanted to check a sort of map of all of the differences between a literate and an illiterate person. And we didn't want illiterate people just because they dropped out of school. We wanted people who just didn't have the chance to go to school at all. So we collaborated with colleagues in Portugal and in Brazil. It was a very international experiment. We found people that lived in villages or poor families that simply didn't have the chance to be sent to school at all and didn't learn to read. And we scanned them and correlated their brain activity with their reading score. So what you see here is brain activity versus how many words they could read per minute. So the illiterates are all the way on the bottom left. And we'll see increasing activation in an entire circuit in people who have better and better reading abilities. Of course, there were some people who hadn't been to school, we call them ex-illiterates. They were able to learn to read from their community or by going to school later on as young adults. So in this way, we could correlate reading ability with changes in the brain. And it's just one slide for a huge amount of work. There are many papers on this work. But simply speaking, first of all, you see here the left hemisphere, language areas of the temporal and inferior frontal region, Broca's area, lighting up when we show a little sentence visually. And of course, the better a reader you are, the more you can access this spoken language system, so the more activity you have there. That's the first finding, accessing the language system. That's what you can do when you're literate. Second, you see here the bottom of the brain. It's like we took the brain and looked at the bottom, and you see these visual areas that are hugely red because they have more and more activation, the better a reader you are. And this is the visual word form area. This is the brain's letterbox and associated areas. And third, we made a finding that these more dorsal regions of the temporal lobe, not exactly shown here, they were also changing even for spoken language. This is a bit less intuitive. Because you've learned to read, you are processing spoken language better. You are hearing the phonemes better, and you are able to do phonological awareness tasks. You're able to move phonemes around in your mind. You're able to play with phonemes. And we found that there is almost a doubling of the brain activity to spoken language as a function of how good a reader you are, as a function of reading score. So that's a huge transformation. We don't fully know, at the cellular level what it means, but there is a huge enhancement of responses in this area. We also found that the connection between these systems, if we look just at the anatomy of the connections of the brain with diffusion imaging, was reinforced. So you can see the network I was showing you on the previous slide here. Visual areas connecting to phonological areas and allowing access to the whole language system. I want to focus a little bit on this area on the bottom here, which I call the brain's letterbox, the visual word form area, because this is really the key, the entry of vision into language. And we know a lot about this region from many, many studies. So just to summarize, first of all, it's always at the same location. All of you in this room, regardless of what you read, you're going to have this left hemisphere activation plus or minus 5 to 10 millimeters. It's always the same location. In all cultures. It will activate more to written words than to anything else. So you can see it here, for instance, if you have an electrode in the right location, you see this activation to letter strings and pseudo words, any written material above anything else, like seeing objects, scenes, faces, and so on. Same here in fMRI. Little patches of cortex activate very selectively to words, among other areas that respond to objects, faces, houses, and so on. And it will activate only to the scripts that you know. So if you have not learned Chinese, it will not activate to Chinese. But if you have learned Chinese, it will. Okay. It will not activate to Hebrew if you have not learned Hebrew, and so on and so forth. And if you have a lesion in this area, this was the case in this patient here, we have several such patients, you will totally lose the ability to read. So there is a causal relation. And when I say totally, these people describe waking up in the morning with a small infarct, for instance, to this area, and they say, well, I look at the newspaper and I don't understand, why is it printed in Hebrew? It looks like Hebrew to me. I can see, these people are not blind, but they cannot recognize any of the letters. That's what this area is doing for you. Okay, and it's very hard to relearn as an adult. So it's really based on child plasticity that this area is able to be tuned to letters. It works completely unconsciously when you're an adult. We've shown using subliminal materials that will activate whenever your eyes land on a word, even if you're not aware of it. Here's a very recent image from our 7 Tesla magnet. Now we can do single subject images. So this is one particular person who happens to be bilingual in English and French. And we created this whole hierarchy of stimuli. They're all 6 letters. But you can see some of them are French words, some of them are English words. And then we have approximations to English or French, and more distant statistics, all the way down to things that could be a word, I suppose, in Polish perhaps, but not in French or in English, right? And you can see very well this reading system. Here in the back of the brain, visual areas will respond equally well to all of these because they have visual stimulation, bars, maybe even shapes of letters. As you move to the front, you get more and more selective to the stimuli that you've learned. These brain areas have learned the statistics of French and English. They've done the shapes of letters, and they've learned how the letters go together. And they do exactly the same job whether you're reading in English or in French, if you're English-French bilingual. Maybe some of you are bilingual also in Spanish, for instance. As long as the alphabet is common, it looks like we're using exactly the same patches of cortex. You can see how precise it is. We used to call it the visual word form area, but it's actually not one area, it's a constellation of little patches of cortex. Because you've learned to read, you've specialized some of these patches of cortex. So yeah, they provide a very fast encoding of letters and the relative locations of letters. That's important as well. You know that words can be anagrams of each other. I suppose in a museum, maybe you play with anagrams. Well, your brain can distinguish anagrams because this area is caring about not just the existence of letters, but the relative locations of these letters. It tells you that this letter comes first, this one comes last in the word that you're currently seeing. Here is the brain of another person who happens to be English-Chinese bilingual. And here we made a little bit of a discovery. Reading Chinese is almost the same as reading in English, and we have a lot of things that are in common. So we created a similar hierarchy of stimuli that are impossible or possible in English and impossible or possible in Chinese. If you read Chinese, you'll know that this is a word. I think maybe this is a word, but this one is not, and so on and so forth. And you can see the hierarchy here. So most of the patches of cortex are common, even when you're reading Chinese and English, but a few are specific to Chinese. So here you see this very strong response to Chinese, but not to English, which is the lighter green bar, and strong response to Chinese, but not to English here. We're still trying to understand the system. There are these patches of cortex that specialize, and because the shapes of Chinese characters are a bit special, we think that the cortex has to dedicate some special resources to that. And one thing we don't understand is that there is this proximity to faces, and reading is a little bit like face recognition. Once you're an expert, it's very parallel processing, and it turns out that the patches that respond to Chinese also respond to faces. So sometimes we see competition, sometimes we see overlap. We don't fully understand it, but it's very, very similar, let's say. So these are all images from adults, but we wanted to get images from children as well. And so we started to do these imaging experiments in children. It's not so easy to scan children. You have to give them stimuli and a task. We ended up choosing this nice task, which I highly recommend. You just flash pictures. Some of them are pictures of words, or faces, or houses, or just checkers. And all they have to do is watch these and click when they see a star. It's a bit like looking for Waldo. So we actually use Waldo in one of our experiments. So they like it, they are clicking for Waldo. But we are interested in these categories that they are not clicking to. And we see activations to them. And if you scan a 9-year-old, this is a group of 9-year-olds here, you can clearly see the reading system is already in place. You have this huge activation to words more than to these other categories. The other categories are in other colors. You can see, for instance, the face system. There's a skinny little activation to faces in the left hemisphere, right next to the visual word form area. There's a huge activation to faces in the right hemisphere. You see this topography of areas. You all have them in this room. There's this whole systematic organization of objects, faces, places, and words. If we scan a 6-year-old who is not a reader, that's what we see. Much less organized system, no visual word form area activation. It's not yet responsive to letters, at least not selectively. It's not just a matter of age, because if we scan kids of about the same age, we see this very strong activation to written words. And you see a sort of intermediate pattern here. It's not fully organized, not as strong. And the face system is already not yet fully organized, but it's coming there. As soon as you learn to read, you see this activation to written letters coming up. It's really not a matter of age. So in this more recent study, we've scanned more children, we've added more children, and we've especially been looking for children who learn to read maybe by themselves, but from preschool. So in this way, we could have very early beginning readers here that you can see already have this visual word form activation selective to words, even though they are quite young. And in this way, we could decorrelate age versus experience in reading. And what we find is that age does not really matter. What matters is the experience of reading for the development of this area. So if we correlate brain activity with both age and how good a reader you are, it's really how good a reader you are which decides the amount of activation here. It's completely different for faces. For faces, it's a very slow development, does not depend on a critical input. Of course, you're meeting faces since you're born, and very slowly this system specializes for recognizing faces. I think the analogy is interesting here. With our schooling system, we're taking this brain, which has the ability to learn things like faces or objects, and we just, at a very precise moment in first grade, we decide that now you're going to get an enormous input of letters. And we feed it with letters and letters and letters, and we see that suddenly this system will develop patches of cortex that specialize for letters. We have a triggering, let's say, of this system by the school input. What I was showing you until now is group studies, but we are also able to follow single children as they learn to read. These are called longitudinal studies, as opposed to the cross-sectional studies that I was showing you before. In particular, a few years ago, we got the permission to scan 10 children up to 6 or 7 times each, which is a bit unusual. It's completely safe, by the way. We can talk about the safety of MRI. Well, you know, 3 Tesla MRIs, high magnetic fields, you could have questions about that. So maybe we can answer your questions later on. But we got permission easily, actually, and we had no problem whatsoever. In fact, the kids loved to come back to the lab. We made a whole point of, explaining to them the brain and so on. We actually printed in 3D little pieces of their brains, or little brains like that they could take home. It was their actual brain, their individual brain that we could print in 3D, so they loved it. Anyways, we got good data. So we were able, our goal was to have 2 scans before school, at the end of preschool, 4 scans all along the school year, and for 8 kids, we had 1 more scan a year later, so after 2 years of experience of reading. This is a quite unique experiment. I don't think there is a similar experiment in the literature even now. So you can see our 10 kids here. We selected 10 kids that started without knowing how to read. So in preschool, they had 0, this is the school entry here. They had essentially 0 knowledge of grapheme-phoneme relationships, which is perhaps a bit unusual. Most kids begin to have some knowledge of grapheme-phoneme relationships early on. But we selected them for that so that they very quickly, upon school entry, school in France is doing a relatively good job, not perfect, but you can see all of these kids shooting up, learning grapheme-phoneme relationships, and a bit more slowly becoming fluent. This is the number of words they could read per minute, which is a bit slower. Okay, so they were learning. So what was changing in their brain? Here is the brain of one of these children, and you can see the successive scans. So preschool, very little activation to the written word compared to other categories, like I showed you before. Suddenly, this is school entry here, and in September, we have already this reading brain lighting up. There are many areas, but I'm going to zoom in on this ventral temporal lobe and occipitotemporal region. Here you can see already the emergence of the visual word form area and also this superior temporal sulcus activation here. They're already in place, and they're just going to grow up a little bit more, but they're already in place right from the start. This is one of the scientific questions we wanted to ask. Do you have to search for this circuit? Is there a massive activation at the beginning following by a narrowing down or something like that? No. There is a circuit which is probably wired already, maybe from birth, which happens to connect vision and language, and we recycle it in order to acquire the shapes of letters. At the same time, we see a very slow change in the face system. So again, there's this nice contrast. Faces you're seeing from the start, and we can see the face system even in preschool. If you look very closely, you see that it's very, very slightly changed. It's barely visible here. But if we do the statistics, we'll see that it's growing in the right hemisphere. And that's something that we've seen, that there is a very fast change in the left hemisphere for learning to read, and that leads to a little bit of a shifting of the faces towards the right hemisphere because of competition between these 2 types of learning. So this is a vision, it's a model, but this is a model of how the visual cortex may change in these children. Before schooling, there's already an organized system. And this system comprises patches of cortex that care about faces, patches that care about houses and places, patches that care about tools and objects, and some of them are still labile. And we think that if you learn to read, you're going to shift many of these patches towards recognizing written words, specializing for the alphabet. But if you don't learn to read, you're going to also use these patches of cortex, and maybe you're going to use them for objects or for faces. So if we scan a literate person, we see these patches respond to words, maybe a little bit to objects. If we scan the very same patches in an illiterate person, we see that they respond to faces and to objects. They are not just sitting there doing nothing. They are part of an architecture which is involved in visual recognition. We slightly shift it by giving them this very particular stimulus, the written word. Right? In fact, we are beginning to understand the system better and better by simulating how it's learning. And this is very, very recent work that we're still doing. We can take artificial neuronal networks. I'm sure you know that there are now wonderful systems that are inspired by the brain a little bit, but they are, of course, part of AI. And they take an image as input, and they can give you an output, which is the category of the image. Maybe it's a bowl, or it's a dog, or it's a table, something like that. And we take exactly the same network, and we recycle it to learn words as well. So we add 1,000 outputs, which are 1,000 words that the system has to recognize regardless of font, of size, of place on the screen. And when we do that, we find that just like the brain, these artificial networks will develop a subset of units, a bit like the visual word form area, specialized for words, tuned to words, more than to anything else, like faces and bodies and so on. And now we can analyze them. This is something we cannot do yet with our fMRI. We can look at single units. We cannot look at single neurons in the human brain so easily. If we look at single units, we begin to understand how it works. There are units in the system that will tune to specific letters as well as to their positions. So here, for instance, this is a unit that likes the letter A, and it likes the letter A on the left side of the word, at the beginning, first or second letter. We find another unit that likes the letter R towards the end of the word. We think that there are hundreds or thousands of such neurons that are tuned jointly to the letter and to the position, with some fuzziness. So they start on the left and on the right, and in the middle of the word it's a bit more fuzzy. Okay. And that's the neural code that we think is being built up by learning to read, which allows you then to take a string of letters and immediately to know, well, the first letter is an A, the last one has got to be an R, in between there are some other letters, and I know which word it is. It's like each word has a little barcode in the brain. And that's the result of learning to read. Each word has a different set of neurons that are being activated, and that allows you to recognize which word it is. Right. I'm sorry, this is a little bit abstract. I'll go back to concrete stuff. But just to get a very concrete picture of what must be happening in your brain right now, you're fixating on a given word. Well, think that there's an assembly of neurons that is being activated, and the nature of which neurons are being activated is like a little map or barcode that tells you which word it is. Right? Invariantly, for the size, the font, whether it's uppercase or lowercase, whether it's handwritten or not, these neurons have this invariance property. Okay, part 2. What happens when children struggle to learn to read? We can also make images of children who are struggling. And that's the first thing we did. Actually, we did exactly the same experiment as before, flashing words, faces, houses, checkers, same exact task. What's beautiful about the star detection task is that even children who cannot read can do it, right? Illiterates can do it, so it's just a perfectly fine task. And when we do that, you can see the disorganization of the reading system in 9-year-old dyslexics compared to 9-year-old readers here. Notice the absence of the visual word form area. Of course, anatomically, it's there. The neurons are there. But it's not specialized, so it's not responding when we present words more than when we are showing other types of pictures. And you might notice that the face system is also a bit disorganized here, and that's still something that we're trying to understand, but it's very significant. There's more activation in normal readers to words in the left hemisphere, and there's more activation to faces in the right hemisphere in normal readers. So it points to some disorganization of the visual system in dyslexia. Of course, you have to be very careful. It's not clear what is the cause and what is the consequence here of dyslexia. And I really want to stress this point. Right? We are showing images. It's a bit better than a lot of the literature because a lot of the literature is in adults. And this is not in adults, this is in 9-year-olds when they are struggling with learning to read. But still, the absence of the visual word form area we think is more the consequence of not learning to read. They are not specializing this area. The cause could be elsewhere. I'll come back to that, but the cause could be in phonology, for instance, and still you would not be developing this region properly. But this is still a matter of research. So we are doing much more work in this area. This is a recent study where we scanned both Chinese and French struggling readers, 10-year-olds. This was a collaboration with Xiaoxia Feng, and we had the very similar paradigm, just the words were in Chinese for the Chinese children, and we found that this reduced visual word form activation is a universal marker of dyslexia, even in Chinese. So you see here the French subjects, and lack of activation of this visual word form area, lack of selective activation. And the same for the Chinese control subjects versus Chinese dyslexic here, missing activation. In fact, you can see the activation here dropping dramatically in this brain region in children who are struggling to read. So at the very least, it's a biomarker. We don't know whether it's a cause or a consequence, but it's a very clear marker of how well you can read. In fact, it's quite amazing. Just by scanning, you can estimate about 50% of the variance in reading scores, the fluency scores, just by looking at the activation of this area. That's how good we are in brain imaging. Only half, right? So behavior is still the main way to monitor the development of reading, and behavior is cheap. In 1 minute of reading, you can get, an estimate of fluency, and that's already better than brain imaging. I want to stress that because some people say, "Oh, my kid is dyslexic, I need a brain scan." Well, no, this is research. This is not very useful, I'm afraid, but it's useful. It's useful to understand how the system works, but it's not yet useful for individual children. But we see this rather remarkable fact, which is that even in Chinese, even in a very different writing systems, the same circuit is still being used. In fact, there is almost no interaction and no detectable difference between reading in Chinese or in French. And the same areas are being underactivated. I don't want to overstress the role of the visual word form, which is here, because there are also these other areas that are being underactivated. So it's a circuit. And all of these regions correlate with reading scores across dyslexics and normal readers. So they show a sort of broad correlation, right? This is the only place in the brain where we see a main effect of language. There's more activation in Chinese in these parietal regions, but there is no interaction whatsoever, which suggests that very similar lack of activation or deactivation, reduced activation, is present in struggling readers throughout the world. But this is a circuit, right? It's not just one area. I've insisted on this area, but the connection to these other language systems is equally important. And we're still trying to sort out in research what is the cause and what is the consequence of the struggling reading. So let's talk a little bit about dyslexias. I would really like to insist on the S. There is not one dyslexia. I think there are lots of ways in which the system can go wrong and can give you a deficit in learning to read. So this is my very schematic view. I had a more refined schema. I decided not to show it. Here I'm really simplifying, okay? Because the cognitive science of reading is much more refined than that. There's a beautiful model by Max Colthart already for several years, decades, and we are using more refined models to try to understand. But let me just give you a sort of summary in one slide, that if you think of this system as connecting vision to language, any of these spots could be the result of an impairment, could be the cause of an impairment, right? So certainly impaired phonology is one of the prime suspects. For many children, it's not hearing well enough the sounds of language and being able to categorize them properly, separate them from each other. It's certainly one of the most important precursors of reading and could be the cause of some impairments. Connection between letters and sounds. You have to develop this connection. If the connectivity is not there, you are going to struggle to learn to read. So impaired grapheme-phoneme conversion itself could be a cause of dyslexia. But we are also finding, I mean, in this lecture, I insist a lot on our findings from the visual system. We know now that the visual code for letters can be one of the causes of some dyslexias. And even there are several subtypes. And we're collaborating with Professor Nama Friedman in Tel Aviv, who's been putting together diagnostic tests of how to distinguish this. We are now finding them in French. She's finding them in all sorts of languages, in Turkish, in English, in Hebrew. What are these subtypes? Well, there are two very important ones to understand. One is letter position dyslexia. These kids know very well their phonemes. They know how letters sound. Their problem is to figure out the positions of letters. So you give them form, and they will say from. Okay? I'm sure you've seen this in your classroom. Yeah. The trouble is in the middle of the word. Typically, the first letter and the last letter are correct, but in the middle of the word, it's all fuzzy. We all suffer a little bit from that. If I show you the word bagged, you might think it's badge, right? I'm sorry, I should have an illustration of that. But we all suffer from that, but these kids seem to suffer more from that. Okay? For them, finding the positions of the middle letters is difficult. They only make these sort of errors. So the interesting diagnostics tools is that you can separate these types of errors and show that their phonology is okay, their attention is okay, and so on and so forth. They only make these sort of errors. Right? What's the right solution? I just showed it to you, is to enhance the differences between the positions of letters. So Nama found that one way to help them is simply to ask them to point with their finger from the left to the right of the word and make sure that they scan the word. And that helps them enormously because it helps them separate the positions of the letters. You can also space the letters. And this has been proven to be helpful for many children. Just put a little bit of a space, maybe half a space between the letters so that they are more separated from each other. But these children will be helped, but not all dyslexic children will have, just these that have this letter position dyslexia. I was telling you that there is another type, which we call attentional dyslexia. It's perhaps not the best name. What do? They have trouble separating the current word from the other words. When you read, you have this typically sentence, right, or text, and you have to focus on one word at a time, moving your eyes. And when you focus on one word, don't get distracted by the others. Well, that's their problem. When you show them form and pale, they might say farm and pole. Okay, and that's the diagnosis test. You give them words like this that can create errors like this, and suddenly they make a lot of them. Notice is a very particular form of error. The position of the letters is respected. So very different from the previous one. They will take the second letter from the other word and bring it into the second position of the current word, or vice versa. So they don't have a problem with letter position. They have a problem with focusing on the current word. And how can you help them? Well, Nama tried a lot of things, but the very simple one is you cut a piece of cardboard, right? It's very cheap. Cut a piece of cardboard and show them how they can slide it so that they only see one word at a time. And suddenly they're good readers, which shows that their phonology is fine, grapheme-phoneme conversion is fine. They're just being distracted by the other letters, right? So I think we are getting much better in describing different subtypes of dyslexia. And this is ongoing work. There is no general agreement. I would think that maybe Guinevere, who is here, might agree with me, Professor Eden, that phonological source is perhaps still the dominant view of dyslexia. But I have no doubt now, and I've changed my mind a little bit based on the data, I have no doubt that there's these other subtypes that are very different, and we need to have careful tools to distinguish them and to rehabilitate them. What dyslexia is not? Maybe many of you think that this is dyslexia, a child who's writing with mirror letters. This is the classical Orton view, 1930s. It's very old, almost a century old now. You have kids, I love this one here. This is an Italian kid who is writing Theodore ti voglio bene. Theodore loves you, right? It's going like this, left and right, right to left, etc. It's called boustrophédon in technical terms. Maybe it's described in this museum. It's how ancient Greek was written. It's like you would plow a field. That's what boustrophédon means. Because you would just switch directions at every end of the field, right? Well, this child has no problem whatsoever. He's going to be a fine reader. It's not dyslexia. It's just a natural property of the system to have this mirror inversion. So a very simple test was done by Cornell in 1985. It's a bit of an anecdotal paper, but I like it because it's so clear. You ask a child to write their names next to a dot. So Lissy and Maggie wrote their names next to the dot. But here there's a problem. The dot is on the right of the page, right? So what do? Well, Maggie, these are two sisters. Maggie is 1 year older. She squeezes all of the letters together cleverly to put her name here. Lissy is 1 year younger, no problem whatsoever. I'll write from right to left, right? It's very simple. When you do this test, Cornell reported that 90% of children will write from right to left at a critical age. You can see it here, around the age of 5 or 6. So it's not dyslexia, it's a normal feature of the system. I just wanted to point this out. It's actually a good indication of this recycling idea that I was proposing to you. The neurons in this area have this property that they recognize mirror images, left-right inversions. It's very important. You have to recognize that this is the same person, right? And yet it's a completely different image. You may not notice, but on your retina, it's a completely different image. It's a problem for the brain. The problem is solved by the very same neurons that we're going to recycle in order to learn to read. So initially, children see this as identical. You don't. For you, it's very different words because you've learned to read. So when we learn to read, we have to unlearn this mirror invariance. And that creates difficulties for all children. All children have difficulties with B's and D's and P's and Q's, but it's only if it stays for a very long time, maybe after 3 years, that maybe it's a sign of dyslexia. It still is not the cause. It's more of a consequence of not learning to read properly, right? You have to unlearn the system. So let's really put this aside. For, I would say, 99.99% of children, this is not the cause of dyslexia. There are some very rare cases where there seems to be a particular problem in their brains, but it's very, very rare. We have not been able to find many cases where this is really a causal factor in dyslexia. You mentioned very kindly my book, Reading in the Brain. I insist perhaps a little bit too much on these mirror errors in this book, and now I think I should do a second edition to revise it a little bit, because we know now this is not the central problem. It's a problem for all kids. You have to attend to it, but it's a problem for all kids. One way to attend to it is to make them write. Because when you write, the gesture is very different for writing a P and a Q or B and a D. So they begin to understand that it's really the 2D shape that counts and not the 3D object that would be inverted in 3 dimensions. Okay, I will finish with a few reflections about how we can use this science for the teaching of reading. And I'm sure you understood that I'm a strong advocate of what I think every scientist in the field believes, that explicit phonics is the right way, because this really corresponds to how this circuit works. You have to detect the letters, connect them to the sounds in order to begin to acquire reading. So the first thing I want you to remember is that there are completely different timelines for spoken language versus reading acquisition. I told you that spoken language starts on day 1. It actually starts in the womb a little bit with prosody. So it really starts extremely early, and it's a very slow process. You are learning about 10 words per day, sometimes 20, more you can. But that still takes years and years and years to achieve knowledge of a language, or 2 languages, or 3 languages. And the early years are really critical, way before preschool, actually. We know now that there's a sort of critical period for the first language. If you're not exposed to a first language, you are in trouble. And that needs to be something like first year, beginning of second year. But if you don't have a language before that, you are in real trouble. You have trouble all your life, basically. I say this because sometimes you have kids who are deaf, right? And they can acquire sign language, that's fine. Sign language is a perfect language, and then they become completely fluent and normal. Or they can be equipped with a cochlear implant, and then they can learn spoken language. But if they have neither of these solutions, then they're in trouble. And we see that they may have lifelong deficits. It's really important. Right? So very slow growth of the spoken language system based on a specialized network. What do we do with reading? Completely different. We insert, around first grade, this massive input of decoding, basically, phonics. And it can go quite fast. Typically, in the first half of first grade, you begin to decode words. At the end of first grade, you should be fluent. In France, we have these guidelines of 50 words per minute, which every child should attain. And of course, it's not finished yet. You're going to learn many, many more words and sentence structures through reading. Reading now becomes another way to learn language, to learn vocabulary. Even though it's the same areas that are doing the job for spoken and written language, they are going to acquire words sometimes from vision, sometimes from the spoken modality, and fuse it together, right? So it's very important that we provide this decoding input. It's like a silver bullet that you put to suddenly enable this new input to language. I've tried to put together in several books. This book is not translated in English, by the way. I should do it, but we're working on it. It's a very small book just for teachers to have the sort of key ideas that you should have when you're trying to learn to read. So we're trying to develop this route from vision to phonology, and later to automatize it so that it becomes faster and faster, and you can go straighter to the lexicon. So here are some of the key ideas. Explicit teaching of grapheme to phoneme conversion, what is called phonics. A systematic progression. We want to use the statistics of language to facilitate the acquisition. We start with the most frequent letters, the most frequent and the most regular grapheme to phoneme conversions. That makes it easier for children. We need a very careful guidance of attention. It's not trivial for children that they have to go from left to right. It's not written anywhere in the stimulus. And if you think of it, it's one of the most clever inventions. I was going to say cleverest, but I think it does not exist. One of the most clever inventions. The time of the spoken word is turned into the space of the written word. Time to space, right? It doesn't get more abstract than this. That's why it's such an amazing invention. It was not invented so many times, right? It's a very, very clever invention, the alphabet. But it's not trivial for children at all. So they have to be taught. You start from the left, you move to the right. Each of these letters or groups of letters is going to turn into a sound, and you're going to be able to hear it. Okay. We need active learning, and that involves writing as well as reading. There's a lot of evidence that learning to write helps learning to read. And the two go together. And I'm surprised that I have to say this, but I had to say it to French teachers, you don't write words that you cannot read, right? It's very simple, but I was surprised that there are preschools where they write entire sentences and the kid cannot read them. That's very silly, I think. The two go together. You teach the very same letters in writing and in reading in a systematic order, but don't anticipate one over the other. One more recommendation, you need to automatize. It's not sufficient to recognize letters. You need to automatize. You need to practice and make it more parallel. I'll return to that. One word about decoding and comprehension, because this is a constant misunderstanding. Teachers oppose decoding and comprehension. If I'm doing one, I'm not doing the other. That's not true, and that's not how cognitive scientists think about it. The correct formula, well, first of all, understanding what you read implies both, right? You need to decode the characters, and you need to have the vocabulary. You need to understand the target language. So think of the Rosetta Stone. You need to know the hieroglyphs, but even if you knew the hieroglyphs, you need to know the target Egyptian language. If you don't, well, you're stuck, right? You need both. So the correct equation is this. And that's a very old word from Gao and Tumner. Written language comprehension is the product of decoding skills and spoken language comprehension. So if one of them is 0, this is finished. Written language comprehension is 0, right? You need to have strong decoding skills and you need to have spoken language comprehension. They go together. And the evidence is very clear. If you enhance decoding, you enhance written language comprehension. So the two go together. But you need to do both. And I told you, this one is slow. Spoken language comprehension is very slow. So many teachers say, well, I taught decoding and still the kids are not good readers. Well, sure. If they are if French is their second language, or in your case, English is their second language, they don't have a lot of vocabulary at home. You know that there is this 30 million vocabulary gap in preschool, that some poor families don't have enough vocabulary. The kids are simply not getting enough spoken input. Well, that takes a long time to compensate. This process is very slow. This one can be fast. So at least give them this, right? Give them this 6 months, 12 months silver bullet of decoding, and then you will give them the ability to learn vocabulary through reading. So vocabulary will develop if they read more and more, right? And you can help them enormously, even if in their families, spoken language is not very present. You can give them written vocabulary, and it will come to land on the same brain areas. So this will be your contribution to their language comprehension, right? This is very important to understand. Stop opposing comprehension and decoding. They go together. There are just two dimensions. Then I want to speak a little bit about the importance of consolidation, because I spoke about the early times of reading, you're learning grapheme, phoneme, but every learning, this is what I discuss also in my other book, How We Learn, every learning starts with explicit, conscious, effortful processing. And as teachers, you know that the kid is struggling, right, with the string of letters. But any learning needs to be automatized. We need to transfer the knowledge to non-conscious circuits. And you need to free the resources of the prefrontal cortex, which is here, 1/3 of the brain, struggling to apply the rules of reading. So in the case of reading, it's very clear. If you take first-year readers, the number of letters is a strong determinant of reading speed. So you see here the time it takes to read a single word when it's 2 letters, 3 letters, 4 or 5 letters. And first-year readers are struggling. They have this linear increase in reading times as a function of number of letters. By the second year, it's almost gone, and by the third year, it's gone. And for all of you in this room, you can read 2-letter words just as well as 9-letter words. But you're almost flat, right, in this curve. It's quite amazing. It means, what does it mean? Does it mean that we are whole language readers? No. I hope you understood no. We are still processing the letters. Your brain is still processing every one of these letters. Just the brain is processing them all in parallel, right? Instead of one by one, it's able to take them all at once, but it's still processing the letters and still converting them into sounds and still at the same time finding this barcode which allows you to recognize the whole word, right? So, automatization is absolutely essential, not just in reading, by the way, but in all sorts of domains. If you're still struggling, if all of your resources consciously are at the level of trying to decipher the word, how are you going to do mathematics? How are you going to focus on the message, right? Right now, you're reading this completely effortlessly, and that's because you've automatized reading and you can focus on my message. But if you were still struggling, could you, let's see if you could, can you read this? Does it make sense? I translated it into Phonics English. I hope. All right. Well, first of all, do you have the feeling of relief when you reach this last two? Okay. Yeah, okay. So now you see the difference between automatized and non-automatized reading. Some of your kids in your classroom are like this, right? They're still struggling. Now, one question: could you understand the sentence? Of course, it's Proust. It's not so easy, but. It's difficult to understand because you are focusing your resources on decoding. And so you cannot focus your resources on the comprehension of the syntax is a little bit complex and so on, right? So this is an example of what struggling kids are going through. I want to go back to my experiment where I was following kids. So at the end of preschool, you remember not much activation for reading. In first grade, there was this explosion of activity. And what I didn't tell you is by the end of second grade, most of the activity is gone, except for this extremely efficient posterior visual and phonological circuit. So all of these additional activation is the struggling. It's the attention. It's the working memory that you have to put together in order to decipher, decode words. So of course, we want to go beyond that stage. In this sense, decoding is not sufficient. You need automatized decoding, but it's an indispensable step. We cannot do without. We have to go through it. There's no way to go straight from this all the way to this. Right? Okay, I will finish because I think my time is up. Just to tell you that I have become much more interested in developing applications of this for education. In France, the Minister of Education 6 years ago called me to create this scientific council for education. And we put together a group of scientists. We are 26 at the moment. Advising on all matters of education and in particular on reading. And there are several things that I think we can do to help. One thing that we did is we, of course, put together resources, and one of them is an evaluation system. At this moment, every first grader and second grader in France is getting a battery of tests, a bit like in the UK, it's called the Phonics check. It's very interesting. And so we are checking not just phonics, but knowledge of letters, fluency, and so on and so forth. So every teacher gets a picture of their class. This goes back to the teachers, very important. Every teacher gets a picture of, my 20 kids or 15 kids, this one, what are their needs? We can see, of course, national statistics like this one here. We can see, for instance, that in 6th grade, there are many kids that are not meeting the standards. The setting of national standards itself is, of course, very important. We are setting the same exact goals in terms of reading speed, fluency, year after year, for every kid, regardless of their socioeconomic status and origin, so that the teachers are encouraged to try to reach this limit. Now, what do you do to reach this ideal level, which at the end of first grade is 50 words per minute? Here is a sample of the reading manuals, just a sample. There is more than 35 reading manuals just to learn to read French in first grade. It's terrible, I think. Sometimes the same publisher has a whole language method and a phonics method just to make money. They really don't care. So what should we do? We have statistics here. There's a very interesting study that was done by Jérôme Doviot in sociology, just asking 10,000 teachers, what are you using? Which reading method are you using? And what is the type of method? And we found out that most French teachers still use, there is no longer a whole language, that is gone. But there is mixed or balanced reading methods. There is a little bit of everything. And most teachers select these balanced reading methods, and they still believe that rote memorization of sight words has to be done, basically. There's no way to avoid it. It's something that you need in order to read sentences and so on and so forth. So the percentage of teachers who use sight words, most of them introduce between around 20 or 30 sight words early on in their reading. And very small minority down here use these manuals. You don't know them, but these are purely phonics manuals that have no sight words, no sentences to guess, and so on and so forth. Who is right? Well, we can use these national statistics to correlate what the teachers do, which manuals they use, and the success of the kids. And the results are quite clear. The synthetic phonics without sight words get the best results. So once again, this is not a new message. We always have the same message. You don't need the sight words. You can learn sight words when they are introduced as graphemes and as phonemes, right? But you don't need to rote memorize words. It's the wrong way. It teaches the wrong system, basically. So we found out that you could have better results with popular schools, low socioeconomic status schools, with a syllabic or phonics method, and worse results in favored schools just because they were using the wrong manual. They were using these balanced reading methods. The evidence is the same in every country. It's been already mentioned 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago in this country. I think we have to just accept the evidence as it is, but this is a bit more subtle evidence now. We don't even need sight words at all. So we're putting out documents for teachers, trainers, authors, and publishers with guidelines about which manuals work better, also what every first grade teacher should know. I don't think we need to know so much about the brain, but we need to know just what works. And it helps a little bit to visualize how it changes the brain, right? We are now in the process of labeling these manuals. So in the future, it will not be possible for publishers to just put out anything out there because the manuals will be labeled. And our scientific council is contributing to the definition of the criteria by which a manual should be labeled as compatible with the science of reading. So these are things that we could still see. We published a note of alert by our scientific council because just a year and a half ago, you could still see in first grade, in the first week of first grade, please read this text, kids. All right, okay, yeah. And so don't do this. We could still see this, which is the most amazing I've ever seen. Can you read this? The letters have been turned into triangles and circles and squares so that this would favor guessing by children. But nobody can read this, not even an adult in this room, right? Nobody. This is just ridiculous. But this was found in first week of first grade for some children in France. So it makes me very angry that we have these very bizarre inventions, right? We have other things. Of course, we have all word guessing. We also have, I don't know if you have this in the US, we have the phonetic alphabet. Professional researchers use the phonetic alphabet to label all of the phonemes in all of the world's languages. But even professionals like Guinevere and I, we don't know this alphabet very well. It's very hard. So why would you do this to kids? You know, they already have one alphabet to learn. Why would they have to learn another? Especially when this one, this is U. Okay. How could you? This is beyond me. I don't know why you would invent these things. Okay, so just one last thing, but I think I will stop. Sometimes, you know, researchers are out of touch with the classroom. This is not the case in my lab, and I'm very happy about that because we have Cassandra Potier-Watkins and also collaboration with other colleagues. We are actually developing software and methods, and we are testing them and doing randomized controlled trials as much as we can. So we've put together this so-called Kalulu software method. There's software and there's a method as well, and games, to put together in one piece, in one manual and one piece of software, all of the principles that we think are useful for children. So systematic pedagogical progression. We have nice AI tools now to take any language and automatically identify what are the most frequent letters, what are the most frequent letter-to-sound correspondences, so that automatically we can design an order for any language about what to teach. We divide the lessons into steps. There's this very nice tracing of the letters, a bit like Montessori sand letters that you all know about, which really helps children to understand the shapes that they have to recognize. The software includes automatic evaluation of how automatized is reading. This is what I was showing you earlier, the effect of the number of letters on reading. So the software can do that. And of course, it's being tested, and we have a positive effect on children. But we used it more as a tool to understand which principles should be used at what time and so on in teaching. So my conclusions. First of all, the brain is a highly structured organ. There is considerable plasticity within an existing architecture, which is the universal architecture of the human brain. Whether you're French or Chinese, we all have the same brain and the same learning algorithms. So for me, it's a supercomputer, honestly. I consider the baby as the best supercomputer on Earth. It's completely unequaled. There is no similar machine, even with today's AI, that is learning as fast, and certainly not with the same amount of power. The brain consumes 20 watts. All right, so currently Google is spending 20 megawatts easily to learn a single language model, to teach a single language model. So I think we have to respect this system, feed it with the best possible input, a well-designed curriculum with explicit teaching, progressively feeding it with the inputs that it needs. I think furthermore and more broadly, education must be based on scientific principles. There's a lot we have to learn together. It's not finished, of course. It's not that neuroscience has all the answers, but we have to work together to figure out the brain's learning algorithms, to experiment in classrooms, to test what pedagogies work best, and to accept the results, because these results on reading, what I told you today, the science of the brain is advancing, but the science of what works in the classroom is at least 30 years old and more. right? So just accept the results. Phonics works best. The whole language method is just unacceptable in today's world. It has been rejected so many times. And with that, I will just conclude and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move right over here to sit down. And thank you. That was fabulous and fascinating. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So think about the questions that you have. I'm sure you have many, and we'll get to those. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time.
No, it's okay. I think we all could have listened longer. Are we on? Are we good? Okay. Great. Okay. I want to ask with start with one of my favorite questions. As a journalist, I know that every career has a story. So I'm curious, why are you a neuroscientist? Why are you so interested in this?
Oh, that's a nice question. I don't know. I was.
Didn't go very far.
I was always fascinated by the brain. I was very good in math. I could have been a mathematician, I suppose. I was training in math and so on, but I was more intrigued by the errors that we were making in mathematics. It's very frustrating when you realize that you got a bad grade because you made a stupid error somewhere. And so I was always very interested in the sort of meta level of asking myself, why am I making this error? Or why is this kid? I was teaching a little bit because I was good in math. So I was teaching young adolescents, and why don't they understand? I understand. What's wrong? So I developed this interest in the brain. Also, as a young mathematician, I was fascinated with AI already at the time. So that was like 40 years ago, I guess. I started to try to program computers to do intelligent things. I realized how hard it was. And I realized that there was a whole discipline of cognitive science, and then later neuroscience, that could help to get answers.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the hardest things. I think there are many teachers in the room. I love that your curiosity was spurred by teaching math, and why don't they understand it? I think that's one of the hardest things is once you become an expert at something, to then understand what it's like to be a novice. And I think a lot of this reading stuff is mixed up in that problem, how difficult
That's
it is.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
In fact, the whole language idea came from psychology. It came from the very curves I showed you. There's this flat curve where there's no length effect, right? We recognize short words just as well as long words. That gave the impression that this is how you read. You just flash a word and you immediately recognize it. But there was no awareness that in order to get there, you have to get through these intermediate stages. Otherwise, you never get there at all. So I think what you are saying is very deep. There is a constant illusion that because I know it's easy, it shouldn't be difficult. We could go straight there. Why spend so much time losing time decoding, right? Where we could go straight to comprehension. Well, it doesn't work this way.
Yeah, I love the image of what it's like in first grade. Like there's nothing there, and then all that effort, and then it gets organized. I'm currently tutoring some kids, and they're in the middle of that. There's all that effort going on, and it's like nails on a chalkboard sometimes to listen to them, like sounding out those words. But you can see in those images, like you've got to go through that to get from point A to point C. You've got to go through that point B.
Yeah, and still we can help, right? We can facilitate this process. It's not true that you just have to struggle for a very long time. We can make this period much shorter. By proper teaching methods and by also rehearsal and so on. So there's a lot more about the science of learning, which goes beyond reading, of course, but which is general. In my book on how we learn, I insist a lot on the role of daily practice and sleep. These are very essential ingredients. The brain consolidates the learning during sleep. So as a parent, you should take advantage of every day and every night, and even every siesta, every nap, right, is a way to consolidate the learning. In this way, you make it much easier.
I'm a big believer in the 20-minute afternoon nap, so things are getting consolidated right there. So I appreciate what you talked about in terms of what you're doing in France to try to connect this and all around the world to the world of education. And there's certainly a lot of discussion. That's why I think we have so many people here today about the so-called science of reading in American schools. And a lot of people are concerned about how their kids are being taught to read. So have you had a similar sort of debate? I think part of the problem here is there's been a tremendous amount of resistance. There's been a tremendous amount of dismissing of some of the basic scientific findings. Is it similar in France, and why?
Yes, there is quite a lot of resistance. It depends very much on who you meet, right? There are many teachers, when I give a talk like this, they are enthusiastic. They think, they come to me and they say, why wasn't I taught this, in teacher training school? So there is that. But there's also a strong resistance. Very often is from the trainers, not from the teachers, but from the trainers of teachers who have been teaching for 20 years in a certain way, and suddenly they have to change, they have to accept that maybe, it was not perfect what they were saying, and that's very difficult. And then there is purely ideological reaction. What has neuroscience got to do with it? These people want to reduce our kids to little machines. They're going to put electrodes in schools. You have all sorts of phantasms that are extraordinary, I think. And, we're not thinking of scanning every child. But, and I have children and grandchildren like everybody else, and I care very much about how quickly they learn and whether we can help them and so on. So, I think this is perhaps the hardest, is all of these phantasms that we have to dissipate, which are very, part of people's beliefs that we have to change. Yeah.
Sounds like it's exactly the same in France as it is here.
Yeah, we come together when we show results, I think. So when you show in a classroom, like with this Kalulu method, we go to classrooms, we convince teachers to try it, and when they see that every child is starting to read by January. And at the end of the year, there's maybe one child who is below 50 words per minute. Then they sort of realize, And we have many testimonies from teachers like that say, I thought it was completely normal for 5 kids out of 20 not to read at the end of first grade. And now we realize, no, it's not right at all. It shouldn't be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. So that's where we all come together, I think, with the sort of concrete evidence from the teachers themselves, because they are doing the teaching, right? I may have given the impression that the manual is doing the teaching. That's not true. The teacher who is doing the teaching. The manual is only some support, right, for helping them to derive a proper progression, a structural progression. So maybe that's something that you have also here in the US. One source of opposition is a very deep belief in the teachers that they have to construct a curriculum. If I have not constructed my own curriculum day after day, I'm not a good teacher. And that's a strange thing, for me, a good teacher is one that has made the kid progress the best, to the most of their abilities, regardless of where the curriculum comes from. So we have these teachers in France who actually complain to have a lot of work because every week they have to create the materials for the next week. Well, they don't have to. In fact, it's very hard to design a good curriculum. It takes years of effort to put it together in a proper order, to try it, feedback. So they don't have to do that. But that's one of the strong beliefs that they have that is also propagated by teacher training schools, that you're not a good teacher if you don't design your own curriculum. That's another big belief that has to be changed, which is quite hard, I think.
I've got one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience. So I guess get your questions ready. I think what you described about what was going on in France is very similar to what's going on in the United States. And I think there was a little bit of an audible reaction in the room when you showed the testing that all kids in France are doing and the results that teachers are getting. And you told me in the green room, they're getting them like in real time. Like teachers are getting this information and
1 or 2 weeks after
after they get it. So it's like progress monitoring for the nation. So I'm curious, since you're now working with educators and policymakers, it sounds like, to try to bring some of this into education, if you have any thoughts or advice for us in the United States in terms of policy. There's a lot of policy making going on right now. We have an even bigger country, and we sort of divide everything. We don't do anything as an entire nation, really. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know the local situation well enough. I've been reading that Mississippi, for instance, been doing incredibly well lately. I hope it's true, but what I was reading was really amazingly positive. I'm also reading that New York is changing dramatically, and in this case, with changing teacher training, which is, one thing is that there is big money involved as well, and so you have to change that, right? That's very, very difficult. There are people who resist just because of the money involved. So I think that what I see in Mississippi and in New York, what I read from the New York Times, seems to be going in the right direction. Why can't you do that together for all states? I don't know.
Good question. Okay, do we have some questions from the audience? I think there's a microphone. There's a woman going around. Caitlin's going around with the microphone. I see someone right there.
Hi, thank you so much. Fascinating, and what a privilege to hear you. I'm a dyslexia therapist, and over the years I've had families come to me with children with a diagnosis of dyslexia who have just spent years and thousands of dollars on vision therapy and say, oh, it's working, but we just want to see if something else can help too. And I said, well, let's try multisensory structured language, syllable-based lay, and see how it goes. And it always, in fact, it has worked every time in helping these children to read. I always bite my tongue now when people ask me about vision therapy, and I wondered if you understand, that's what we call it here.
What do you call vision therapy exactly? Maybe in one.
I'm not an expert, but what I hear from parents is a few times a week where the child goes and they follow to strengthen their eye muscles or something sort of as intervention for dyslexia.
Ouch.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the more I try to enter a little bit the field of dyslexia, the more I am surprised by the diversity of just crazy bullshit. It's just, it's just no, seriously. So in France, we have a company now that sells glasses for dyslexics, which are blinking very fast, and that's the cure for dyslexia, right? They think it's in the retina. I mean, we have every evidence in the world that it's not in the retina, it's not in the muscles. It's in the brain, in different brain areas. There's probably different subtypes, but it's really a learning issue. I will not say that there is nothing in the eyes, in the eye movements. This is actually a research question for me. For facility, in all of the experiments that we have done here, we avoid eye movements because eyes are creating artifacts in our scanners and so on. So that's a little bit of a critique. There is an eye movement component to reading, which I've not described here today. You have to learn to move your eyes very quickly to the next word and then to the next word. And of course, if you're not very precise with that, you're not going to be a very fluent reader, at least in the late stages. But at least initially, the single word is really the good paradigm here, and this has nothing to do with eye muscles or whatever, right? So, no, I would advocate for being reasonable. There is a diversity of dyslexias, but they don't involve the muscles, they don't involve the retina, they require focused cognitive training. And indeed, as you said, grapheme-phoneme practice is some of the most efficient. Yeah. With some of the additional tools that I described, focusing on the letter position and focusing on whether the kids are receive interference from the peripheral words. That seems to be key.
Another question? I don't know. There we go. Okay.
On your research, thank you very much for this, by the way. You showed as they are learning to read, the facial recognition also increases. Does that mean they can find more details in faces? They can tell them apart? And if there's a way to increase facial recognition that also helps their reading, do you do any for the reverse, like helping with facial recognition helps them with processing of language? Or
that's a great question, but we don't know so much. It's a bit of a mystery, the relation between reading and faces. It was a completely happenstance discovery. What we found was more competition. These areas that specialize for letters cannot specialize for faces at the same time, so there is a little bit of cortical competition. So there is a tension between competition for the surface of the cortex, but also enhancements that generalize across different categories. And we found a little bit of both. So I'm sorry I cannot give you a very precise answer here. For instance, being a reader helps you to become a very good in vision, precise vision of very small letters. It's not by chance that we start with large letters and we go to smaller and smaller ones, I think, because we're progressively training, I think, but that's a hypothesis, more and more early areas of the cortex to discriminate these very fine shapes. And that has some generalization, not just to faces, but to any shape, actually. So we have enhancement in early visual cortex for any shapes. Yeah. Still, I think there is one bad idea in what you are saying is if we train faces, would we enhance reading? No, I don't think so. You have to train reading. There's also a very frequent mistake that we make, by the way. We hope for far transfer, far generalization. We are actually doing an experiment in another domain right now in the lab. We have kids that have music training, and the hope is that this will generalize to math, for instance. Well, at the moment, we are not finding that. And in the literature, there is very little evidence for that, because far transfer is unlikely if you are not teaching precisely the content that you need to teach. So you need to teach mathematics if you want the kids to know their mathematics. You need to teach reading if you want them to be good readers. That's just a very simple rule. Yeah.
Another question? Ah, here. Can we get a mic up here? Oh, sorry. All right, we'll go here and then we'll go back there.
Hello, thank you very much for today. I wanted to ask a question. I'm a dyslexic therapist as well and work with students with dyslexia. I've recently seen students who read actually very fluently, but are having great difficulty with spelling. I'm assuming that their phonics skills aren't as good as what might be, and I try to work with that. But do you have any suggestions? Have you looked at that?
No.
Idea whether spelling is really the issue? And
there is a whole category of deficits called dysgraphia, dysorthographia, which are different. They're really different. And in French, it's particularly a problem because French is relatively regular from the spelling to sound direction, but in the opposite direction from the sound to the spelling is very difficult. There are many irregularities. So you need additional training in that specifically, I think. But the areas, at least I don't know very well, I don't think there is as much research at all on graphia, graphics, writing, as opposed to reading. It's much more difficult also to study in the scanner, so it's not very well studied.
Thank you.
In the back.
Hi, hello. I'd like to ask what changes in reading acquisition occur maybe in children who are blind, if there is less activation in the visual word form area and more in the sensory motor areas of the parietal lobe to accommodate for Braille.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It turns out that when you read in Braille, you still activate the visual word form area. And this is really a formidable finding, and it's also a challenge, right? So somehow the information about Braille is getting to that area, probably in a top-down manner, because now this area is not being innervated by visual input, but still it plays an important role. Yeah. We don't fully know whether it plays a role in the recognition itself, or maybe a role in the higher level functions of language. The study of the blind is really super interesting for us. We know that the blind, especially early blind, are going to use their occipital cortex for something else, for completely different functions. So it's another evidence of recycling. And different bits of the occipital cortex will care about language, and other bits will care about mathematics. There's a lot of mathematics activation in the occipital lobe in the blind. I speak a little bit about that in my book, How We Learn, but we're still doing experiments. I think it's unknown. What do they do with these brain areas, and how is the information getting there if it's not getting from the retina? This is not really well known. Yeah.
I think we might have time. I have failed to wear a watch. How much time do we have?
1 minute.
Oh, great. Let's do one more question. Does someone have the microphone in their hand right now, or okay, we got a question in the back.
So I'm hoping that I can articulate this question because it refers to some of the visual images that you were giving earlier. But the visual word form portion of the brain, if the person doesn't learn to read, it typically that area is recycled for tools or for other forms, houses, and faces. But in the dyslexic brain, if that area is not being used for reading and other pathways are found, do we see that they have abilities that are particular to dyslexia because they're using that portion of their brain for houses and faces and words, and then that they're using other portions of their brains for decoding and reading? Are we seeing those kind of differentiations that kind of characterize dyslexia?
So not specifically in this area. And in general, in the literature, there is small literature on whether the dyslexic children may have advantages. But I don't think that this is a very stable literature, and I don't think that there is any very convincing demonstration. One suggestion has been this mirroring, but maybe it has nothing to do with dyslexia. Just if you're not unlearning mirror image recognition, maybe you are able to see some mirror images a little bit better. And we had some evidence for that in our illiterate subjects. They were suffering a little bit less in a task where you have to recognize mirror images. And there is one paper that suggests this could be useful for scientists to recognize graphs. This is very, very speculative. And I think very, very unstable scientific literature. The bulk of the finding is that no, these children are struggling, and it doesn't look like they have very strong advantages. Maybe they have the advantage that if they surmount the difficulty, they are showing character, they are showing effort, they are understanding the value of effort, and maybe this has positive consequences later on in their lives. Winston Churchill is a famous dyslexic who got the Nobel Prize, right? And is an amazing figure. But I don't think we should think of dyslexics as especially gifted in something else, or it's just kids that require a little bit of help in a specific domain.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and join me in thanking Dr. Dehaene for coming from France. Thank you so much.